The alarm on my wrist device buzzed 3 times before I even opened my eyes. 3 buzzes meant only one thing. The Galactic Assembly wanted me, and they wanted me now. I sat up in my quarters aboard the orbital station Meridian and stared at the small blinking light on the wall panel. My name is Ethan Cole, and 6 months ago I was just a logistics officer helping coordinate supply routes between human colonies. Now, I was the only human representative allowed inside the central chamber of the largest political body in known space. I still did not understand why they had chosen me instead of someone with more experience. I would understand soon enough. I dressed quickly and walked through the curved hallway that connected my quarters to the transport pod. The station was quiet at this hour, but quiet in a strange way, like the air itself was holding its breath. Even the maintenance drones that usually hummed along the corridor walls had stopped moving. I told myself it was nothing. I was wrong. The transport pod carried me across open space toward the assembly spire, a massive structure built by combining the architectural styles of a dozen different species. Tall glass towers twisted upward like frozen smoke, catching the light of 3 distant suns. I had seen this view many times before, but today, it felt different. Today it felt like walking towards something that was about to break. When the pod docked, 2 Volari guards greeted me. The Volari are tall, calm, and rarely show emotion on their smooth gray faces, but today, their eyes moved too quickly. Their hands trembled slightly as they opened the door for me. I had spent enough time around them to know that trembling was not normal. "They are waiting," one of them said. His voice cracked in the middle of the sentence. I nodded and walked past him into the central chamber. The chamber was enormous, shaped like a perfect circle, with hundreds of seats rising upward in levels like a stadium. Representatives from more than 40 different species filled those seats. Beings with feathers, beings with scales, beings that floated instead of walked, all staring down at the small round platform in the center, where I now stood alone. I had addressed this chamber before. I knew what silence usually sounded like here. Polite, respectful, distant. This silence was different. This silence had weight. It pressed against my chest like a hand. At the highest platform sat the assembly chair, a being named Threll Vashon, from a species called the Dorith. The Dorith are ancient, wise, and known for never raising their voice, no matter the situation. Threll always spoke slowly, carefully choosing every word. Today, his hands gripped the edge of his podium so tightly that the metal beneath his fingers began to bend. "Ethan Cole," he said. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "Of course," I answered. "What's happening?" He paused, so lasted long enough that I began counting the seconds in my head. 5, 6, 7. "We need to know something," he finally said. "And we need the truth, not comfort." "I'll tell you the truth," I said. "I always have." Another pause. Then he looked directly at me, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw real fear in his eyes. "Is it true," he asked, "that humans do not fight wars the way the rest of us do?" The question hit me strangely. It felt too simple for a room full of this much tension. "I don't understand," I said. "What do you mean?" A representative from a species called the Okran stood up from the lower seats. The Okran are insect-like beings, calm and analytical, rarely emotional in public settings, but his mandibles clicked rapidly as he spoke, a clear sign of distress in his species. "We have studied your species' history," the Okran representative said, "your conflicts, your methods. We need to understand something before we make a decision that could affect every civilization in this assembly." "Go on," I said carefully. "In our galaxy," he continued, "wars last decades, sometimes centuries. Species fight with rules, boundaries, rituals. We preserve populations. We negotiate slowly. We accept long periods of conflict because ending a war too quickly is considered reckless, even disrespectful to those who have died." I nodded, though I still did not see where this was going. "But your species," he said, "your wars end quickly. Completely. In a matter of years, sometimes months. And when they end in a way that leaves no possibility of the same conflict continuing later." I felt a small chill move down my spine, though I still did not fully understand why this frightened them so much. "We fight to end problems," I said honestly, "not to manage them." The chamber went completely silent, not a single sound, not even the soft mechanical hum that usually filled the room from the translation devices. Threll leaned forward. "Explain that to us, please, in detail." I took a breath, unsure exactly how to answer without sounding proud or frightening. When humans go to war, it's because something threatens enough of us that we believe it must be stopped completely. We don't fight to weaken an enemy. We fight until the reason for fighting no longer exists. Another representative, this one from a species called the Naseth, a tall, wing-shaped being with pale blue skin, spoke next. Her voice trembled. "You mean you fight until the enemy is destroyed?" "Not always destroyed," I said. "Sometimes it means surrender. Sometimes it means the enemy simply stops being able to continue. But we don't create wars that last for generations. We consider that a failure, not a strategy." The Niseth representative sat back down slowly, as if the weight of my words had pushed her into her seat. Threll finally spoke again. "Ethan, we have a serious problem, and we believe your species may be the only ones capable of solving it. But before we ask for your help, we need you to understand what we are truly asking." "Then tell me," I said. He gestured toward the large display floating above the center of the chamber. Images appeared, planets glowing with soft light, cities built into mountains, oceans full of strange but peaceful creatures. Then the images changed. Cities in ruins, populations reduced by half, entire regions of space marked with warning symbols. "This is the Kryveth Dominion," Threll said, "a coalition of aggressive species that has been expanding for the last 30 years. They have taken 12 worlds from members of this assembly. Each time, our combined forces engage them using traditional methods, careful advances, controlled retreats, long negotiations, ritual combat between designated warriors to settle territorial disputes." "And it isn't working," I said, already understanding the answer. "No," Threll said, "it is not working. Every year, they take more. Every year, more of our people suffer. Our way of war was built for stability, for preserving relationships between civilizations that must continue to exist together for centuries. But the Kryveth do not follow our traditions. They do not honor our rituals. They simply take what they want, and our methods cannot stop them." I looked around the chamber. Every single face, every species, every representative stared down at me with a mixture of hope and terror. "You want humanity to intervene," I said. "We want to understand what that would truly mean," Threll said. "Before we make that request, we need to know exactly what we would be unleashing." I stood there for a long moment, feeling the full weight of the room pressing down on me. These were not soldiers asking for backup. These were leaders of an entire galaxy, asking permission to release something they clearly did not fully understand and clearly feared. "I think," I said slowly, "you already know what it means. You just need someone to say it out loud." Threll nodded once. "Then say it." I took a breath. "It means the Kryveth Dominion stops existing as a threat. Not in decades, not through slow negotiation. It means we find the fastest, most complete way to end this, and we do not stop until it is finished." The silence that followed was different from before. It was not confusion, it was understanding. And understanding, in that chamber, looked exactly like fear. Threll closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Then we must decide," he said, "whether we are willing to invite something into this war that we may never be able to fully control again." I did not answer him right away, because I realized, standing there in the center of that enormous circular chamber, surrounded by species who had built peace through centuries of careful tradition, that they were not afraid of losing this war. They were afraid of what would happen if they won it the way humans knew how to win. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after I spoke. Then Threll raised one hand, and a new image appeared above the center platform. It was not a picture of the Kryveth Dominion this time. It was a picture of Earth. "Before we vote," Threll said, "the Assembly requests something difficult. We need to understand your history. Not summaries, not reports written by outside observers. We need to hear it from you, in your own words, so that every representative here understands exactly what we would be requesting." I felt my throat tighten. Explaining human history to an alien audience was not new to me. I had done it before in smaller settings, cultural exchanges, academic panels, quiet conversations with curious diplomats, but never like this. Never with this many lives depending on how well I explained it. All right, I said, I'll try. I began slowly, the way I always did when speaking to non-human audiences who had no context for what I was about to describe. For most of our history, I said, humans fought wars the way many of you still do. Slowly. With long periods of negotiation. With rules that both sides mostly followed. Wars could last for years, sometimes for generations, passed down from parents to children, like an inheritance nobody wanted. Several representatives shifted in their seats, nodding slightly. This part of the story felt familiar to them. But over time, I continued, we learned something important. Long wars did not save more lives. They cost more. Every year a conflict continued, more people suffered, more families were broken, more resources were destroyed. A war that lasted 20 years did not protect 20 years of peace. It only spread suffering across 20 years, instead of concentrating it into a shorter, more decisive period. A representative from a species called the halvin, small furred beings known for their careful mathematical way of thinking, raised a clawed hand. You are saying, the halvin representative said, that ending a conflict quickly, even through overwhelming means, causes less total suffering than allowing it to continue slowly. Yes, I said. That is exactly what we learned, sometimes through terrible experience. There was a period in our history where two devastating global wars occurred within the same generation. The second was worse than the first because the first war ended without truly ending the conflict. The underlying problems were never fully resolved. They were only paused. And a paused conflict does not stay paused forever. I paused, letting that sink in. After that second war, I continued, our species made a decision that shaped everything that came after. We decided that if a conflict must happen, it must be resolved completely, not paused, not managed, resolved, because a war that ends without truly ending simply becomes a promise of a future war, and that future war is often worse than the one before it. Threll leaned forward. This is very different from how most species in this assembly understand conflict resolution. I know, I said. For many of your civilizations, wars are treated almost like long-term negotiations. Careful, controlled, designed to preserve relationships between the two sides, because you know you will need to coexist again afterward. That approach works well when both sides respect the same boundaries. But it fails, the Okran representative said, standing again, when one side does not share those boundaries. Exactly, I said. The Krivith Dominion does not fight the way your assembly fights. They do not follow your rituals. They do not respect your careful pacing. While you are negotiating boundaries, they are expanding past them. Every year you spend trying to manage this conflict slowly, they use to grow stronger. A long murmur spread through the chamber, dozens of quiet conversations happening at once, in a dozen different languages, all being translated into overlapping whispers through the room's translation systems. Threll raised his hand again, and the murmuring stopped. Tell us more, he said. Tell us what happens when humans decide a conflict must end completely. I nodded and continued. When we commit fully to ending a conflict, I said, we remove hesitation from the process. We do not fight to weaken an enemy over time. We fight to eliminate their ability to continue the conflict entirely, as quickly as it can be safely done. This often means overwhelming force applied early, rather than gradual escalation over years. You mean you strike first, and you strike hard, said the Niseth representative, her wings folding tightly against her back. When necessary, yes, I said. But it's not about aggression for its own sake. It's about mathematics, in a strange way. The longer a conflict continues, the more total suffering it creates. So the fastest possible resolution, even one that requires significant force early on, ultimately saves more lives than allowing a conflict to continue gradually, for years or decades. This sounds like a philosophy built entirely around efficiency, the Halvin representative said, rather than tradition or honor. In some ways that's true, I said. We value the outcome more than the process. A long, honorable war that leaves generations broken is not something we consider a success, even if it followed every rule correctly. A short, complete resolution that ends suffering as quickly as possible, even if it looks less traditional, is something we consider a victory worth pursuing. Threll was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. There is something else we must understand, he said. Your species has had access to weapons capable of ending entire conflicts almost instantly for a very long time, and yet your civilization still exists. Your species did not destroy itself. How? This was the part of the conversation I always found hardest to explain, because it touched something deeper than strategy. It touched restraint. Because, I said, the same philosophy that tells us to end conflicts completely also tells us that unnecessary destruction is a failure, not a strength. Ending a war does not mean destroying everything in sight. It means removing an enemy's ability to continue fighting in the most controlled and precise way possible, while limiting suffering as much as we can along the way. So you use overwhelming methods, the Ocran representative said slowly, but only enough to accomplish the goal, never more than necessary. Exactly, I said. It's not about causing as much destruction as possible. It's about applying exactly enough decisive action to end the conflict permanently, then stopping immediately once that goal is achieved. We do not celebrate prolonged suffering. We consider prolonged suffering to be the greatest failure a conflict can produce. The chamber fell into a long silence again. I could see representatives glancing at each other, some nodding slowly, others still clearly uneasy. Thrall finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. This is why we fear what we are considering. Not because your species is cruel, because your species is capable of ending something completely, and once that door is opened, it cannot be closed again. If we ask for your help, and your species applies this philosophy against the Kriveth Dominion, there will be no slow negotiation. No prolonged conflict, no careful management over the coming decades. There will be an ending, I said quietly, one way or another. Yes, Thrall said, and we are not entirely certain we are prepared for how quickly that ending might arrive, or how thoroughly it might be delivered. A representative I had not yet heard from stood up from the highest section of seats. She belonged to a species called the Corvain, tall beings with dark feathers and sharp, intelligent eyes, known throughout the assembly for rarely speaking unless absolutely necessary. May I ask something directly? She said. Please, Thrall answered. She turned toward me. If this assembly asks your species to intervene, and your species agrees, will there be a way to stop the process once it begins? If we decide partway through that this method is too extreme, can we call it back? I thought carefully before answering, because I knew the honesty of my answer mattered more than anything else I had said so far. No, I said. Once a decision like this is made, and once the reasoning behind it is fully understood, calling it back partway through often causes more harm than letting it finish. Stopping a decisive action halfway can leave an enemy wounded but not defeated, angry but not eliminated as a threat. That creates exactly the kind of unresolved conflict we spent generations learning to avoid. The Corvain representative studied me for a long moment, her sharp eyes unreadable. Then this is not a request for temporary assistance, she said. This is a request to permanently change the nature of this war, and possibly the nature of every future conflict this assembly will ever face. Yes, I said, that is exactly what you would be requesting. Thrall straightened at his podium, and I could see him gathering the strength to speak the words that would decide everything. Then this assembly must vote, he said, not simply on whether to accept human military assistance, but on whether we are prepared to accept the consequences of a war that ends completely, rather than one that continues to be carefully managed for generations to come. He raised his hand toward the central display, and a new symbol appeared. One I had learned meant an official vote was about to begin. All representatives, he said, prepare to cast your decision. Once this vote passes, there will be no slow escalation, no gradual introduction of human forces. If we choose this path, we choose it completely, because that is the only way this particular solution is capable of functioning at all. The chamber grew tense again, hundreds of representatives glancing toward each other, some already raising their hands, others hesitating, clearly torn between fear of the Kriveth Dominion and fear of what they were about to unleash against them. I stood alone in the center of that circular platform, watching an entire galaxy prepare to decide whether they were more afraid of losing a war slowly or winning one quickly. The vote passed with a result that surprised even Thrall. Not unanimous, but close enough that the outcome was never truly in doubt. Fear of the Kriveth Dominion had finally outweighed fear of what humanity might do to stop them. 2 days later, I stood in a smaller meeting room deep inside the assembly spire, surrounded by a very different kind of gathering. This was not a full session with hundreds of representatives. This was a negotiation table, with only a handful of senior diplomats, military officials from several species, and me, representing a species that had just agreed to reshape an entire war. Across the table sat a Dorith military coordinator named Yavel Orenth, an old and respected strategist who had spent decades managing the slow, careful engagements against the Kryveth Dominion. Beside him sat a representative from a species called the Trennic, heavily armored beings responsible for coordinating logistics across dozens of allied fleets. Before your forces arrive, Yavel said, we must establish clear terms of engagement, rules that respect the traditions of this assembly, even while incorporating human assistance. I had been preparing for this conversation since the vote passed, and I already knew this part would be difficult. I understand your instinct, I said carefully, but I need to be honest with you. If human forces are placed under rules built for slow, traditional warfare, we will not be able to deliver the outcome you voted for. The entire reason our approach works is because it is not slowed down by rules designed for centuries-long conflicts. Yavel's antennae twitched, a sign of clear discomfort among his species. You are asking for complete autonomy, no oversight, no restrictions. I'm asking for something specific, I said. Full authority over strategic decisions once human forces are committed, without requiring approval from the broader assembly command structure for every individual action. Not because we don't respect this assembly, but because hesitation and slow approval processes are exactly what has allowed the Kryveth Dominion to keep expanding for 30 years. The Trennic representative shifted in his heavy armor, his mechanical voice modulator crackling slightly. This is highly irregular. Every allied engagement in this war has required joint command approval before any major action. And every allied engagement has resulted in the Dominion taking another world, I said, keeping my voice steady but firm. I'm not asking you to trust us blindly. I'm asking you to trust the outcome you already voted for. You cannot vote to accept a philosophy built around decisive, rapid resolution and then attach it to a command structure built around careful, gradual consensus. The two cannot function together. Yavel exchanged a long glance with the Trennic representative. Neither spoke for several seconds. What exactly are you proposing? Yavel finally asked. A joint command structure that respects assembly oversight for broad strategic goals, I said, but grants full tactical autonomy to human forces once a specific engagement begins. We will share information. We will explain our reasoning. But we cannot pause mid-operation to seek approval for every decision, because pausing mid-operation is often the single most dangerous thing that can happen in this kind of engagement. And if we disagree with a specific tactical decision after it has already occurred? Yavel asked. Then we will explain it to you afterward, I said honestly, and you will decide whether to continue this partnership going forward. But asking us to stop and explain during an active engagement is asking us to introduce exactly the kind of hesitation that creates the long, unresolved conflicts your assembly has struggled with for decades. The room fell into a long, uncomfortable silence. Finally, a new voice spoke from the far end of the table. It belonged to a Niseth military officer named Elira Path, one of the few in the room who had actually engaged directly with Kryveth forces in the field. I have fought this war for 11 years, she said quietly. I have watched careful strategies fail against an enemy that does not respect our rules. I have watched worlds fall because we spent months debating the correct response while the Dominion simply acted. She looked directly at Yavel. Perhaps it is time we consider that our own methods, however respected and traditional, are the reason this war has lasted so long in the first place. Yavel's antennae lowered slightly. A gesture I had come to understand meant reluctant acceptance among his species. Very well, he said finally. We will grant the terms you have requested. Full tactical autonomy once an engagement begins, but full transparency afterward, and complete honesty in every report you provide to this assembly. You have my word, I said. Human command does not operate through secrecy. We simply operate without hesitation. Over the following weeks, preparations moved faster than anything I had witnessed in my time working with the assembly. Human command had clearly been preparing quietly for this possibility long before the vote occurred, because within days, transport vessels began arriving at designated rally points along the border of Kryveth territory. I traveled with the advanced diplomatic team aboard a mid-sized carrier named the Holloway, a vessel far smaller than many of the massive assembly warships I had seen throughout the war. It surprised several of the Allied officers accompanying us. "This is the extent of human deployment?" asked a young Trennick officer, as we monitored the arrival of additional vessels on the bridge display. "We were expecting a much larger fleet." "Numbers aren't always the deciding factor," I said. "Coordination is." The human fleet that gathered over the following days was, admittedly, smaller than many of the massed assembly formations that had engaged the Kryvith Dominion in previous years. Sleek, fast vessels, built for precision rather than overwhelming size. Support ships coordinating logistics with an efficiency that impressed even the skeptical Trennick officers monitoring our approach. Word of humanity's involvement had clearly reached Kryvith Command by the time our forces completed their staging. On the fourth day, we received a transmission, an open broadcast meant to be intercepted, addressed directly to the Assembly Coalition forces stationed nearby. The Kryvith representative who appeared on the display was a tall, heavily built being, with dark reddish skin and sharp features, wearing armor plating designed more for intimidation than practicality. His voice, translated through our systems, carried a tone of clear amusement. "We have heard rumors," he said, "that the great and powerful Assembly has recruited a new ally, a species so feared, so legendary, that entire star systems tremble at the mention of their name." He paused, glancing off-screen at something, then laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "And what have you sent us? A handful of small vessels, a fleet smaller than what we have destroyed in a single engagement on countless previous occasions. Is this truly the great weapon the Assembly has been so desperately searching for?" Beside me, Illyra Path's expression darkened. "They believe your species is weak because of fleet size." "Let them believe that," I said. "It won't matter for very long." The Kryvith representative continued his broadcast, clearly enjoying the opportunity to address an audience he assumed to be frightened. "We have fought this war for 30 years. We have expanded across dozens of systems. We have defeated fleets 10 times the size of what you have brought before us today. Tell your new allies that we welcome this challenge. Perhaps humanity will provide us with entertainment before joining the long list of civilizations that have learned to fear the Kryvith Dominion." The transmission ended, and the bridge fell into an uneasy silence. "They do not understand what they are facing," Yavel said quietly, standing beside me now, having joined our vessel personally to oversee the coordination effort firsthand. "No," I said. "They don't, and that's exactly the advantage we need." Over the following 2 days, Human Command finalized preparations with a level of quiet precision that unsettled even the officers who had voted to allow this intervention. There was no dramatic build-up, no lengthy speeches, no ceremonial gathering of forces meant to project strength through spectacle. Instead, small teams moved efficiently between vessels, checking systems, coordinating logistics, preparing detailed strategic plans that were shared with Allied Command exactly once, without room for extended debate or revision. I attended one final briefing before the engagement began, held aboard the Holloway in a small strategic room where human commanders outlined their approach to the assembled Allied officers. The commander leading this operation was a woman named Grace Whitmore, calm, precise, and entirely unbothered by the pressure of the moment. "Our approach will not resemble anything you have seen in this conflict so far," Grace explained to the room. "We will not engage the Kryvith Dominion through prolonged, gradual confrontation. We will identify their core command and logistical structure, and we will remove their ability to continue this conflict as quickly and completely as possible." "And if they refuse to surrender before that point?" Yavel asked. "Then the outcome will be decided through action rather than negotiation," Grace said simply. "We have found, throughout our history, that some conflicts cannot be resolved through words alone, especially when one side does not intend to honor those words in the first place." Illyra leaned forward slightly. "How long do you anticipate this engagement will take?" Grace glanced briefly at the tactical display before answering. "Weeks, not years. Possibly less, depending on how quickly the Kryvith command structure recognizes the position they are in." A murmur of disbelief passed through the Allied officers in the room. 30 years of slow, grinding conflict, and this human commander spoke as though it might end within a matter of weeks. You sound very confident, Yavel said, though his tone carried more unease than doubt. I'm not confident because I underestimate the Kriveth Dominion, Grace said. I'm confident because we have spent our entire history learning exactly how to end conflicts decisively, rather than simply surviving them for as long as possible. She turned to address the room fully now, her voice calm, but carrying clear authority. Every plan we have prepared accounts for minimizing unnecessary harm wherever possible. Our goal is not destruction for its own sake. Our goal is removing the Kriveth Dominion's ability to continue this war, as completely and as quickly as we can, while limiting suffering along the way, as much as circumstances allow. She paused, glancing briefly toward the display still showing the recorded image of the Kriveth representative from his earlier broadcast. They believe our smaller numbers represent weakness, she continued. They are about to learn that some of the most decisive victories in history were never won through size alone. The room remained silent for a long moment after she finished speaking. I could see the mixture of hope and unease on the faces of the Allied officers gathered there, the same expression I had witnessed throughout every stage of this process, since the very first meeting in the assembly chamber. As the briefing ended and officers began preparing for the engagement ahead, Illyra approached me quietly. 30 years, she said softly. 30 years of careful strategy, of preserving tradition, of trying to manage this conflict responsibly. And now? I asked. She looked toward the tactical display, where markers indicating Kriveth positions glowed steadily across the projected star map. Now I find myself hoping, she said, that the fear surrounding your species is justified. Because if it isn't, we may have made a terrible mistake in bringing you here. And if it is justified, I asked quietly. She turned back toward me, her expression unreadable. Then I fear we have made an equally terrible decision, simply for entirely different reasons. I did not have an answer for her, because I understood exactly what she meant. We were no longer simply discussing a war. We were discussing what would happen after it ended, and whether the galaxy she had known for her entire life would look anything like the one that remained once humanity finished what it had come to do. The engagement began at a time chosen entirely by human command, without prior announcement to the broader assembly coalition. I learned of it only when Illyra rushed onto the bridge of the Halloway, her wings tense against her back, informing me that human vessels had already begun moving toward Kriveth-held territory. They didn't wait for a formal signal, she said, clearly unsettled. They didn't need one, I said, watching the tactical display update in real time. Every plan was already finalized. Waiting any longer would only give the Kriveth Dominion more time to prepare. The human fleet moved with a precision that even I found difficult to fully process, despite having grown up around stories of human military history. Rather than advancing as a single-mast formation, the fleet split into several smaller, highly coordinated groups, each targeting a specific location within Kriveth territory, almost simultaneously. Grace Whitmore's voice came through the shared communication channel, calm and steady, addressing both her own forces and the Allied officers, monitoring the engagement from a safe distance. Primary targets identified, she said. Central command network, logistical supply routes, and forward staging points. All groups confirm synchronized timing. Yavel, standing beside me, studied the tactical display with visible confusion. They are not engaging the primary Kriveth battle fleet at all. No, I said, understanding immediately. They're not trying to win a battle. They're trying to remove the enemy's ability to continue fighting one. Within the first hour, reports began arriving from the various engagement zones. Kriveth communication relays, positioned to coordinate their forces across multiple systems, went silent almost simultaneously. Supply convoys, essential for maintaining their expanding territory, found themselves unable to proceed as coordinated human vessels moved to intercept key routes with overwhelming speed and precision. They haven't fired on a single Kriveth warship yet, Illyra said, watching the reports scroll across the display with growing disbelief. They will, if necessary, I said. But removing an enemy's ability to communicate, resupply, and coordinate often accomplishes far more than direct confrontation ever could. The Kriveth Dominion, accustomed to 30 years of slow, predictable engagements, appeared entirely unprepared for the speed and coordination of the human approach. Reports indicated confusion spreading rapidly through their command structure, as isolated fleet groups found themselves unable to communicate with Central Command or receive updated instructions. By the end of the first day, 3 major Kryvith staging points had been rendered completely inoperable, not through prolonged confrontation, but through swift, coordinated action that left defending forces confused and disorganized before they could mount any meaningful resistance. Grace's voice returned through the communication channel that evening, addressing the Allied command structure directly. Kryvith Central Command has attempted to re-establish communication with their forward positions 3 times in the last 6 hours, she reported. Each attempt has been unsuccessful due to the disruption of their coordination network. Their ability to organize a unified response has been significantly reduced. What is your next step? Yavel asked, his voice carrying a mixture of caution and growing amazement. We offer them a chance to reconsider their position, Grace said simply. A recorded message was sent directly to the last known operational Kryvith command node, broadcast on an open frequency they could not ignore. I listened as Grace's voice, calm and without any trace of anger or aggression, delivered the message personally. This conflict can end in one of 2 ways, she said. Your forces can stand down, allow negotiations to begin regarding the return of territories taken from Assembly member worlds, and this engagement will conclude without further confrontation. Or your forces can continue attempting to resist, in which case your ability to continue this war will be removed entirely, as quickly as circumstances allow. There was no immediate response. Over the following 2 days, human forces continued their methodical approach, targeting logistical and command structures rather than engaging in prolonged confrontation with Kryvith combat vessels whenever possible. Several Kryvith commanders, cut off from central coordination and increasingly desperate, attempted direct engagements against isolated human vessels. Each attempt ended quickly, often within minutes, as coordinated human tactics and superior positioning neutralized these isolated attacks with minimal losses on either side. Reports confirmed that human forces consistently prioritized disabling enemy vessels over destroying them outright, whenever a safer alternative existed, a detail that visibly surprised several Allied officers monitoring the engagement. They are being far more careful than I expected, Illyra admitted quietly on the 3rd day, reviewing updated reports alongside me. I assumed, given everything we discussed, that this would be far more destructive. It doesn't need to be more destructive to be decisive, I said. The goal was never destruction. It was removing their ability to continue this war. Disabling accomplishes that just as effectively, when it's possible to do so safely. By the 5th day, the majority of Kryvith forward positions had been rendered inoperable, their supply lines disrupted, and their central command structure fractured into isolated, disconnected groups unable to coordinate any unified strategy. Reports indicated growing unrest among Kryvith field commanders, several openly questioning leadership decisions that had led their forces into this position. On the 7th day, a transmission arrived, addressed directly to Assembly Command. The Kryvith representative who appeared this time was not the same confident figure from the earlier broadcast. His expression carried none of the previous amusement. His voice, translated through our systems, carried clear strain. We wish to discuss terms, he said simply. Grace's response came almost immediately, calm and measured as always. Terms will include the complete withdrawal of Kryvith forces from all territories taken from Assembly member worlds during this conflict, verified through joint inspection teams, along with binding commitments preventing further expansion into Assembly territory. You have crippled our ability to resist within a single week, the Kryvith representative said, his tone shifting between frustration and something closer to disbelief. 30 years of conflict, and this assembly finally found a solution capable of ending it in days. We did not come to fight a war the way this conflict has been fought for 30 years, Grace said simply. We came to end it. The silence that followed on the Kryvith transmission lasted several long seconds before the representative finally responded. Then let it end, he said quietly. Formal negotiations began the following day, conducted primarily through Assembly diplomatic channels rather than human command directly, honoring the agreement that human forces would step back from direct political involvement once the military objective had been achieved. Grace's forces maintained their positions, ensuring compliance without escalating the situation further, while Assembly diplomats worked to finalize the specific terms of withdrawal and future restrictions on Kryvith expansion. I stood on the bridge of the Holloway during those final negotiations, watching alongside Yavel and Illyra as the last details were confirmed. 12 worlds, previously taken by the Kryvith Dominion over 3 decades of slow, grinding conflict, were formally returned to assembly protection within the span of a single week. 30 years, Yavel said quietly, staring at the tactical display now showing confirmed Kryvith withdrawal from every contested territory. 30 years of careful, traditional engagement, and it ends within 7 days of human involvement. It's not about doing more, I said. It's about doing exactly what's necessary, without hesitation, and stopping the moment the objective is achieved. Illyra remained quiet for a long moment, staring at the display with an expression I found difficult to fully read. I fought this war for 11 years, she finally said. I watched entire generations of soldiers dedicate their lives to a conflict that never seemed to have an ending in sight. She turned toward me slowly. And now, within a single week, it's simply over. Is that a good thing? I asked quietly. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I suppose that depends entirely on what happens next. 3 months after the Kryvith Dominion formally withdrew from every contested territory, I found myself once again standing on the small round platform at the center of the assembly chamber. The room looked exactly the same as it had the first time I stood here, hundreds of representatives filling the rising seats, the same circular structure, the same soft lighting reflecting off polished surfaces. But the atmosphere had changed completely. The fear I had sensed during my first appearance was still present, but it no longer resembled the fear of an unknown threat approaching from beyond assembly borders. This fear was quieter, more complicated, directed inward rather than outward. Threl Vachon stood at his podium, studying me with the same careful expression he had worn during our very first conversation. Ethan Cole, he said, the Assembly has called this session to formally address the outcome of recent events, and to discuss what comes next for the relationship between your species and this Assembly. I'm listening, I said. A representative from the Halvan species stood first, his small furred frame trembling slightly, as he addressed the chamber. In 1 week, your species accomplished what this Assembly failed to achieve in 30 years of careful, traditional conflict. 12 worlds returned. Thousands of lives saved from continued suffering. This success cannot be denied. He paused, glancing around the chamber before continuing. And yet, many representatives here now find themselves questioning what this means for the future of conflict resolution across this Assembly. If a single intervention from your species can resolve decades-long conflicts within days, what does that mean for the traditions this Assembly has relied upon for centuries? The Corvain representative I remembered from the earlier session rose next, her sharp eyes fixed steadily on me. There are some among us, she said, who believe humanity should be granted a permanent role within this Assembly's military structure, a standing force capable of resolving future conflicts before they are allowed to continue for decades, as this one nearly did. She paused, her feathers shifting slightly. And there are others, she continued, who believe the opposite, that humanity's capabilities represent a danger too significant to allow continued involvement in Assembly affairs, regardless of how effective this most recent intervention proved to be. I stood quietly, listening to the debate unfold across the chamber, various representatives voicing support for one position or the other, the room slowly dividing itself into 2 clear groups. Finally, Threl raised his hand, calling for silence once again. Ethan, he said, turning his attention fully toward me, this Assembly requests your honest perspective. Should humanity continue to play an active role in resolving conflicts across this Assembly, or should this recent intervention remain an isolated event, never to be repeated? I considered the question carefully before answering, aware that whatever I said next would likely shape the future relationship between my species and every civilization represented in this chamber. I think, I said slowly, you're asking the wrong question. The chamber fell silent, waiting. You're asking whether you should use humanity as a tool, I continued. Something to be deployed whenever a conflict becomes too difficult to manage through traditional methods. But that's not really what happened here, and it's not what should happen going forward. Then what would you suggest instead? Threl asked. I'd suggest, I said, that this Assembly consider why conflicts like the one with the Kryvith Dominion are allowed to continue for 30 years in the first place. Not because ending them quickly is wrong, but because your traditions were built around a specific assumption that every civilization in this galaxy shares the same respect for boundaries, rituals, and negotiation. I looked around the chamber slowly before continuing. That assumption isn't always true. And when it isn't true, your traditional methods don't just fail to end conflicts quickly. They actively allow those conflicts to continue far longer than necessary, causing far more suffering than a quicker resolution ever would. The Halvan representative who had spoken earlier tilted his head slightly. You're suggesting our traditions themselves may be responsible for prolonging conflicts we could have ended much sooner. I'm suggesting, I said, that every method of conflict resolution has situations where it works well, and situations where it fails completely. Your traditional approach works beautifully between civilizations that share similar values and boundaries. It fails when facing an opponent who doesn't share those same limits. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. Humanity's approach isn't meant to replace your traditions. It's meant to serve as an option, used only in situations where traditional methods have already failed, and continuing to rely on them would only prolong suffering rather than prevent it. Threll studied me for a long moment, and who decides when that threshold has been reached? This assembly does, I said, through careful consideration, exactly like you did before this recent conflict. Humanity should never be deployed lightly, or used as a first response to every disagreement between civilizations. That would be a mistake, and it would eventually cause more harm than good. I looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of as many representatives as I could. But when a conflict reaches the point where traditional methods have clearly failed, where suffering continues to grow year after year, with no resolution in sight, that is exactly the situation where a different approach becomes not just useful, but necessary. The Niseth representative, still visibly uneasy from our earlier conversation months before, spoke quietly from her seat. And if we grant your species this role, even one used only in extreme circumstances, how do we ensure it never becomes something used carelessly? Through exactly what we're doing right now, I said. Through open discussion, careful consideration, and honest evaluation after every single intervention. Humanity doesn't want unchecked authority within this assembly. We want a partnership built on trust, established through demonstrated restraint, not fear. The chamber remained quiet for a long moment, representatives glancing between each other, clearly weighing everything that had been discussed. Finally, Threll spoke again, his voice carrying the same careful authority I remembered from our very first meeting. This assembly will take time to consider these words carefully, he said, but I believe I speak for many when I say that today's discussion has shifted something important. We came here today searching for a decision about whether to fear your species or to rely upon them. He paused, studying me thoughtfully. But perhaps the more important decision, he continued, is learning how to work alongside a species capable of ending conflicts so completely, without losing sight of the caution and wisdom that has guided this assembly for so long. I nodded slowly. That's exactly the balance we should be working toward. As the session began to conclude, representatives slowly rising from their seats to continue discussions in smaller groups throughout the assembly spire, Illyra approached me quietly from the lower level of the chamber, her wings folded calmly against her back for the first time since I had met her. You handled that better than I expected, she said. I meant every word, I said. She studied me for a long moment. Do you believe this assembly will find the right balance? Using your species only when truly necessary, without becoming dependent on a solution that ends conflicts so quickly that we forget the value of patience entirely? I considered her question carefully before answering. I hope so, I said honestly. Because the moment this assembly starts reaching for that solution too quickly, without exhausting every other option first, we risk losing exactly the kind of careful, thoughtful diplomacy that prevented far more conflicts than it ever needed to resolve through force. Illyra nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. 30 years of slow conflict ended within a single week, and now, this assembly must decide how to live with a species capable of ending wars so completely. That's the real challenge now, I said, not winning wars quickly. Learning to live responsibly alongside those who can. As I walked out of the assembly chamber that day, passing beneath the same twisting glass towers, that had greeted me during my very first visit months earlier. I understood something clearly that I hadn't fully grasped before. The Galactic Assembly hadn't called upon humanity because they believed we were simply stronger or more capable than every other species in known space. They called upon us because, when every careful tradition and negotiation had failed, they needed something capable of delivering a complete and lasting resolution, even if that solution terrified them as much as the threat it was meant to end. And somewhere deep within that fear, I realized, was the beginning of something far more important than mere military alliance. It was the beginning of understanding, however uneasy, that some problems in this galaxy could only be solved by those willing to end them completely, rather than simply manage them forever. As I stepped into the transport pod that would carry me back toward the Halloway, I glanced one final time toward the assembly spire behind me, its glass towers still catching the light of 3 distant suns, exactly as they had the very first day I arrived. The war was over, but something told me, standing there in that quiet moment, that the far more difficult conversation about what humanity's role in this galaxy would truly become was only just beginning.